It took 4 words, just 4. Dog to the moon. Elon Musk tweeted it at 6:03 a.m. By 9:20, $720 million had poured into Dogecoin from small-time investors, students, Uber drivers, night shift nurses, ex-Marines with pensions. By noon, 3 major trading apps had crashed under the flood of mobile trades. By 1:47 p.m., a 19-year-old pre-med student in Ohio had lost every dollar of his tuition savings. By sunset, Dogecoin had crashed 38%. One of those believers was a 22-year-old medical student in Ohio. His family found him hours later, lifeless outside his dorm. His final message was recorded on a cheap webcam. Eyes red, hands shaking. I lost everything because I believe in someone who plays with markets like toys. 5 hours. That's all it took. From emoji to obituary. But that wasn't the only death that day. Just down the PTOAC, while the internet melted down over Musk's tweet, a very different kind of announcement was quietly posted on a government site. The Office for Civil Rights under the Department of Education was being shut down. No press release, no debate. Just a buried memo. Signed, sealed, executed. Gone was the federal oversight protecting students from discrimination. Gone were the investigators who held schools accountable for targeting trans and queer kids. And leading the Republican push behind it, Congresswoman Marjorie Greene, the same MTG who once hung a sign outside her office reading, "There are only 2 genders." A calculated insult aimed at her Democratic colleague across the hall, a mother of a transgender child. The same woman who told a cheering crowd in Georgia, "We will wipe out the gender lunatics corrupting our classrooms." They love her for it. They roared as she spit fire into the mic, one hand gripping a Bible, the other a flag. But outside the headlines, outside the rallies, the story was different. Women's health clinics were shutting down. Shelters for LGBTQ+ youth defunded. Lines formed around the block for community clinics. Some people were told, "Try again next fiscal year." And online, a new phrase surfaced, "Elon lead you died." Not from activists, but from angry college students who had lost their savings to a meme they thought was a movement. And somewhere, watching all of this unfold from the cracked screen of her iPad, was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. She sat alone at a station bench, her overnight bus just pulling into Union Station. No entourage, no makeup, just a woman carrying the weight of too many stories, one of which used to have a heartbeat named Lana. The headline on her screen read, "Dog, Elon, and the Discrimination Machine. Congressional hearing incoming." She closed the iPad, took a breath, and stood up, not as a politician, but as a witness. Because sometimes the law doesn't break all at once. Sometimes it frays quietly, until someone decides to speak the words, no one else will. This isn't madness anymore. It's a blueprint. The Capitol could wait. Before Jasmine could speak for millions, she had to stand for one. So instead of heading straight to the hearing room, she took a quiet detour to a place where memory was heavier than any microphone. Some names are carved into history, some are carved into stone, and some, like Lana Kim, only exist in the spaces where both failed to protect them. Jasmine stood in Arlington as the wind brushed past like a memory with a name. The sunlight filtered through the thinning leaves, casting soft shadows across a headstone barely visited. On it, a name, a year, a silence. Lana Kim, 1987 to 2020. She didn't cry. Jasmine had already cried in every place where tears felt useful. On the hospital bench, where no one came to explain what had happened. On the phone with a hotline that only took urgent physical harm. At the pharmacy that refused to fill a hormone prescription because the marker didn't match the profile. She had cried then. Now she remembered. Lana wasn't a headline. She wasn't a transgender fatality statistic for a year-end report. She was the girl who believed you could change the world by listening better. Who color-coded her notebooks and made pancakes at 2 a.m. Who once told Jasmine, "If I ever disappear, don't let them use me as a lesson. Make me a reason." She tried to get help. She called, file begged. But under the Trump administration's reversal of ACA's Section 1557, being trans no longer counted as a protected status. Her identity became a bureaucratic mismatch, a box unchecked, a denial code. And one day, Jasmine found herself holding a letter, creased, tear-stained, written in Lana's tidy handwriting. Jazz, if I'd been born different, maybe they would have let me live. But I'm so tired now. I'm sorry. That letter had never left Jasmine's briefcase. It sat beside bills, proposals, and policy drafts like a splinter she refused to remove, because it hurt less than forgetting. She placed the bouquet of lavender gently down. It wasn't just the flower Lana loved. It was what it symbolized: peace, healing, memory. You're not just a reason, Lana, she whispered. You're the spark. And then she heard it, a slow, steady rhythm of footsteps, measured, not hesitant, like someone who knew this wasn't their moment, but came anyway. She turned. There he stood, Greg Cassar, backlit by the lowering sun like a silhouette cut from resolve. A manila folder rested under one arm, the other hand gently pressed over his chest, almost like an apology or a pledge. He said nothing at first, because men like Greg don't enter rooms to be noticed. They enter when it's time for the silence to end. Son of immigrants, organizer before politician, the kind of man who knows what it means to walk through systems built without you in mind, and still fight to fix them. He didn't just read the reports. He wrote them. He didn't just hold the data. He'd march beside the people behind every number. Greg hadn't come for a soundbite. He'd come for the record. He looked at Jasmine. She didn't speak either, because she already knew what he was about to say. And more importantly, so did he. Then, with a voice so low it nearly folded into the wind, I wasn't sure if now was the right time. But I figured if anyone could turn grief into fire, it'd be you. Jasmine didn't move, didn't smile, but her eyes softened in the way people do when they finally realize they're not alone in their rage. He stepped closer, holding out the folder. 21 co-signers. We've got data on Elon, on her trades. Timelines airtight. We've got one shot to make it matter. She reached out, took the folder. Her fingers brushed his for the briefest second. No words, just solidarity. Then she looked back at the stone one last time. Not in mourning, but in oath. They had the microphone long enough, she said. Now it's our turn to speak. And together, they walked toward the Capitol, toward the moment where silence would no longer be an option. Some moments don't need marketing. They ignite on their own. When word leaked that Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and Representative Greg Cassar had officially filed for an emergency oversight hearing on financial manipulation and civil rights abuse, the nation didn't just listen. It leaned in. Within 12 hours, CNN, MSNBC, ProPublica, and Vice announced wall-to-wall live coverage. Petitions exploded. Thousands of tweets. Called a reckoning, decades overdue. And maybe you remember where you were when it happened. Let me ask you something. Have you ever felt that strange, electric hope when someone finally says what everyone else has been too afraid to? Because that was the energy rippling across the country. But not everyone was trembling. 3 days before the hearing, the first counterpunch came on Twitter. Elon Musk, the man who can collapse stock values with a single wink, posted only 8 words, summoned by the clowns of Congress. Popcorn or rockets? 1.5 million likes, 20,000 replies, and a meme that spread like oil on fire. Greg and Jasmine, their faces crudely pasted onto dancing clowns beneath a spinning dog coin. But you see, this wasn't comedy. It was defense by humiliation. Because when facts don't serve you, mockery often does. And while the internet fought over whether Elon was trolling or testifying, another voice thundered in from the far right. Marjorie Taylor Greene didn't just respond, she declared war. Wearing a crimson suit that matched the tone of her rhetoric, MTG appeared live on Steve Bannon's War Room. No script, no apologies. Let me tell you what this really is. A PR stunt. These radicals want to parade me in front of a panel like I'm some kind of criminal. I'm not afraid. I am Congress. I am the Constitution. And I will not let a bunch of transgender freaks rewrite our laws with fairy dust and pronouns. Now, stop here for a second. Have you ever heard a public official call a fellow citizen freak on national media and wonder how we got this far off the rails? She wasn't defending policy. She was baptizing bigotry. The next morning, America woke up to a headline in bold ink. The New York Times, Musk and Marjorie to face congressional firestorm. The sun hadn't yet cleared the dome of the Capitol when the line began to form. By 6 a.m., it curled halfway down Constitution Avenue. Students, teachers, mothers, veterans, staffers who had quietly taken a morning off. Some held coffee. Most held signs, Justice for Lana. Hold the billionaires accountable. Stop hate, not data. On the steps of the building that had for decades stood as a symbol of democracy, something ancient stirred back to life, belief. Inside the hearing room, the air had a weight to it. Every camera light was lit. C-SPAN, YouTube, MSNBC, Vice, Al Jazeera. 8 live streams, all pointed at a single table at the front of the room. ACLU sent a delegation. GLAAD took a full row. Human Rights Campaign passed out policy briefs. In the hallway, the BBC's Washington correspondent stood outside, her voice hushed. This may be the most anticipated congressional hearing in over a decade. Not just because of who's testifying, but because of who's listening. And then the doors opened. Elon Musk entered first. Turtleneck black. No tie. No notes. Just that signature grin. Half dismissive, half amused. He scanned the room like it was a showroom of obsolete tech, then leaned into the first camera he passed and said, "Hope the Wi-Fi is decent." Might mint this moment into an NFT. A few chuckles from the press pool. Not many, because behind him came something colder. Marjorie Taylor Greene, scarlet jacket, leather briefcase. She moved like she owned the room, like every chandelier bowed to her when she walked past. Her eyes met Jasmine's, and she smirked. Oh, look who dared to summon a mock trial. I've seen weak women before, but naive? That's new. The silence that followed wasn't from shock. It was from rage held in check by decorum. Every lens tilted toward the front table. And then Jasmine Crockett stood, not with a shout, not with a fist, but with the calm of someone who knows exactly what she came to do. She adjusted the mic, looked out over a sea of suits, sweat, and expectation, and said quietly, clearly, "Ladies and gentlemen, this hearing on policy impact and market manipulation is now in session. We're not here to convict, but we are here to reclaim the truth." And just like that, the circus collapsed and a courtroom took its place. There are moments when silence isn't an absence. It's pressure. And inside that hearing room, walls lined with policy aides, nonprofit lawyers, and journalists who had waited years for something real to break through. Jasmine Crockett became that pressure. She didn't look around for permission, didn't fumble with papers. She simply reached for the folder beside her. The same folder that had sat on too many desks. The one with bent corners and tabs in red, yellow, and grief. And then she began. Over the last 4 years of the Trump administration, this country witnessed the systematic erasure of civil rights protections. Not through tanks, not through riots, but through policy memos. Her voice didn't rise, but somehow it filled the room more than the cameras did. The slide behind her glowed to life. In 2017, federal protections for transgender patients were rescinded under ACA 1557. In 2018, $260 million slashed from anti-sexual violence programs. In 2020, the biological first rule forced students to compete under birth certificate gender. And by the end of it all, 13 civil rights offices in education and health had shut their doors. You could see the assistants on the far wall whispering. Even the security details shifted their weight because this wasn't rhetoric. It was receipts. What do you call a nation where identity becomes disqualification? Where surviving discrimination requires paperwork more precise than a scalpel? Some call that policy. I call it sanctioned abandonment. Marjorie Taylor Greene's eyes flicked toward the press pit. Then she leaned in, her voice dripping with practice scorn. This is a political stunt. But Jasmine didn't look at her. She clicked the remote again. The screen flashed to a tweet so infamous it barely needed context. On May 4th, 2021, Mr. Musk posted this tweet. Within 8 hours, the coin's value plummeted. $11 million evaporated. The SEC received 17 indirect fatality reports. And yet, Mr. Musk has never once taken responsibility for his influence. Not even a public warning. Then, for the first time, she turned toward Elon. We teach children to clean up after their mess. Billionaires, they retweet the wreckage. Somewhere in the third row, a young man let out a quiet, sharp breath. A girl beside him whispered, "That's it." And still, Jasmine wasn't done. She opened the folder again, this time not as a policymaker, but as someone who had carried a name with her for too long. I didn't come here to make this personal, but I would be lying if I said it wasn't. A rustle in the gallery. Someone stood straighter. Phones were lifted. This is the denial letter my friend Lana Kim received from her state's Medicaid office. Reason, gender marker incongruent with treatment request. Even Elon looked up this time. Lana didn't die of cancer. She didn't die in a car crash. She died because a box on a form didn't match a box in a system. She died because someone at a desk decided identity was optional. She died quietly, just like policy intends. She paused, not for effect, but because it hurt. Lana is now a statistic, one of thousands. But today, I refuse to let her remain a number. Because when policy kills and nobody listens, then this building is no longer Congress. It's complicity. Across the table, Elon leaned toward MTG, a half-smirk curl behind his fingers. "This is getting emotional." And Jasmine, without a blink, answered, "We brought 75 pages of logic. If it feels emotional to you, it's only because somewhere along the way, you lost the part of yourself that should have cared." The room did not erupt. It inhaled, and every eye turned, not to the screen or the tweet or the folder, but to the woman holding the truth like it had always belonged to her. Jasmine Crockett's last words hadn't just landed. They lingered. Her question to Elon about logic versus empathy had left the room in a hush so dense, even the cameras seemed to lean in closer. But she wasn't done, because it was never just about billionaires and tweets. It was about those who weaponized tradition, who draped hatred in the fabric of so-called family values, who, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, didn't hide their bigotry. They broadcasted it. Jasmine turned her body slowly, but with intent. Behind her, the screen changed again. A map of America appeared, splintered in blood-red states, each one highlighted, each one with a number. Funding cut. Protections repealed. Children silenced. You say you protect women, Mrs. Greene, but you voted to slash funding for rape survivors. You voted against the Equality Act. You tweeted that gender is God's decision. Yet, you want to inspect students before they're allowed to run track. The gallery froze. Not because it hadn't heard this before, but because this was the first time someone said it where it could no longer be ignored. Let me ask plainly, who are you protecting, and from whom? Marjorie shot up from her seat, fist clenched as if righteousness had a posture. "I'm protecting traditional values," she barked, fury cracking in her voice. "No one has the right to call themselves a woman if they weren't born one." A sharp inhale from the back row, from the front row, even from the press box. But Jasmine, she didn't recoil. She advanced quietly, like truth with a blade under its sleeve. "So if I'm raped, but I don't give birth, do I still qualify as a woman in your America?" The sentence hit like glass shattering on marble. The gavel didn't come fast enough, because in that moment, the room wasn't waiting for rules. It was waiting for answers. MTG's face flushed, not from fury, but from recognition that the crowd had already made its judgment. Even Elon, for once, looked sideways, searching the room like a man unsure where the punch had come from. Order was called, but order couldn't silence what had already been named. Then Jasmine stepped back, not to retreat, but to pass the torch. The fire was lit. "I've said enough about those pushed to the margins," she said, voice steady. "Now, let's talk about those abandoned in the middle of the crowd, and what it means when a government pretends not to see them." Her gaze shifted. Greg Casar leaned forward, hands folded, the kind of stillness that only comes before an aftershock. "Congressman Casar, the floor is yours." When Jasmine Crockett sat down, she didn't just pass the mic. She passed the weight of truth. And Greg Casar caught it like a man who'd carried that weight before. He didn't stride to the podium. He didn't perform. He moved like someone who knew. You don't need volume when the facts are loud enough. Behind him, slide 17 flickered onto the screen, a single quiet data point. Order placed, April 3rd, 3:09 p.m. executed, 3:01 p.m. finalized. Data Corp, $150,000. No music, no cue, just the hum of a nation holding its breath. Greg spoke in a voice, so even it cut sharper than shouting ever could. This stock jumped 22% after that order. The day after, President Trump announced a 90-day tariff freeze on digital imports. The earliest trade that day was yours, Mrs. Greene. Chairs didn't squeak. Phones didn't click. Even the gallery stopped blinking. Now, if this wasn't insider information, then one of two things must be true. Either you saw the future, or the future was scheduled in advance. Marjorie Taylor Greene shot up like a fuse had been lit. You're twisting this. I have a financial team, licensed professionals. They use technical indicators, not political gossip. Greg turned slightly, not toward her but toward the audience. And then the next slide appeared. 6 spikes, 6 trades, 6 near-perfect timings, each within 48 hours of White House policy drafts. Technical indicators? Then explain why 6 of your recent trades lined up exactly with executive decisions drafted by the administration you endorsed. A reporter whispered into her mic, "He's got her pattern." Greene's voice cracked just enough to expose the tension behind the words. "Do you even have evidence for that?" Greg didn't flinch. He faced the camera, the one live streaming to millions. "We have 87 pages of documentation from ProPublica, the independent financial watchdog. It's available to this committee, to the media, and to the American people." A murmur spread through the room like static. One aide leaned toward another. You could hear keys tapping, fast, desperate. Then Greene barked. "This is a hearing, not a courtroom." Greg didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. You're right. But in a courtroom, you don't get to speak without swearing under oath. The air shifted. A few claps broke out, then more. And from the back, one voice, clear as a bell. "Checker trades." It wasn't a chant. It was an indictment. The room was still vibrating from the data Greg had dropped. But what came next was colder. He didn't pause to let the tension settle. He simply tapped his screen, and the lights dimmed. On the projector, an old clip began to play. Raw, unedited. Charlottesville, 2017. Torches, chanting, marches under Confederate flags. And then the voice of a president. You also had people that were very fine people on both sides. No music, no voiceover, just the weight of the words. Greg stood in silence, letting the video end on its own, as if the nation needed to sit in its own echo for a moment. Then he spoke, not loud, not angry, just clear. In the last 6 years, synagogues have been burned across red states. Jewish families have pulled their children from schools after Nazi symbols appeared on lockers. Flyers blaming George Soros for everything from COVID to election fraud have been mailed to homes. He turned to the committee, not just the members, but the whole room. And when a U.S. president calls torch-bearing fascists very fine people, then every deflection, every excuse becomes complicity. No one exhaled. Not yet. He shifted his stance, now facing Marjorie Taylor Greene directly. "Mrs. Greene, you posted only 2 genders outside the office of a mother with a transgender child. You've amplified conspiracy theories, accusing Soros of controlling the U.S. government. And today you sit here on this committee, under oath." MTG snapped back, voice sharp. "You're twisting my words. I'm not anti-Semitic. I'm anti-elite fakery." Greg didn't flinch, didn't blink. "Good. Then raise your hand now and condemn the words spoken in that clip." Marjorie froze. The silence that followed wasn't from confusion. It was from calculation. She glanced sideways. Elon Musk, who'd spent the last 10 minutes leaning back like none of this concerned him, was now staring down at the table. Greg turned to the rest of the Republican panel. "Anyone here willing to say out loud, a man who calls fascists his friends cannot lead this nation?" Just one hand. The cameras turned, slow, one by one. The room became a theater of avoidance. No hands. Even the air stopped moving. Greg's voice dropped a register, not soft but solemn. Silence has a sound, and today it's louder than any slogan. The stillness was not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that follows a landslide. Not because the earth stopped moving, but because it already had. After Greg's final question, no Republican lifted a hand. Elon Musk remained frozen, eyes fixed somewhere beneath the mahogany desk. The cameras were rolling. The feed count ticked past 11.4 million. And Marjorie Taylor Greene, she stood. Not like a leader rising, like a fuse igniting. Her chair screeched backward. One foot nearly tripped over the base. She didn't care. Her knuckles widened around the ceremonial gavel, which had been left resting near her seat. A prop never meant for her grip. She slammed it onto the wood. You think this is a win? This isn't justice. It's a goddamn ambush. Her voice cracked through the room like lightning over dry land. You sit there with your charts, your data, your smug questions. But I know America. I don't need a subpoena or a spreadsheet to tell me what's right. Her eyes darted between Jasmine and Greg, but not like a debater, like someone cornered by ghosts she couldn't name. Jasmine stood unshaken, not reacting, only watching. Greg remained seated, his arms folded, his expression still, because they both understood what was happening. This was no longer about policy. It was survival instinct televised. Marjorie's voice escalated again, screech becoming scream. Freedom belongs to us. Not to freaks, not to data warpers, not to little boys pretending to be girls and calling it rights. A ripple moved through the crowd. Not to liars with microphones who think sympathy makes them moral. You people don't deserve to speak. Then something broke. Not in her voice, but in the room. A woman near the back stood up, her voice trembling, but fierce. You just called my daughter a freak. Another voice followed. A man, older, louder. Justice for Lana. Then another from the press section. She's melting down. This is it. Someone clapped, once, then twice. Then it spread like a slow wave. Elon Musk didn't move. He didn't speak. But his hand, once resting on the table, had clenched into a fist beneath it, thumb pressed so hard against his palm it turned white. His mouth was closed. His jaw locked. For a man who had made billions on speaking freely, he had never looked more terrified to speak. Greg leaned forward, his voice low, the microphone barely catching it. That's the sound of power when it realizes no one's afraid of it anymore. And it was true. Marjorie was still yelling, but it didn't echo because something had shifted. The room no longer tilted toward her noise. It tilted toward those who had listened, who had grieved, who had waited for someone to name the rod out loud. This hearing is adjourned, the moderator bellowed. But it wasn't just the hearing ending. It was a performance collapsing. The entire chamber stood, and then thunder, applause. Not for show, not for one side beating the other, but because the illusion had snapped and the truth had survived it. Jasmine reached for Greg's hand, and for a moment, one brief, almost sacred beat, neither of them looked toward the cameras. Because sometimes the truest victories aren't for the audience. They're for the people who kept standing when the room wanted them to sit down. By the time the gavel fell, the world wasn't quiet. It was awake. The hearing had ended, but its aftershocks tore across the media landscape with the clarity of a bell. Clips of Jasmine's confrontation and Greg's razor-cut cross-examinations flooded Twitter, YouTube, Reddit. One clip in particular looped endlessly. Marjorie Taylor Greene, gavel in hand, face twisted with fury, screaming above a chamber no longer listening. Someone overlaid the footage with Beethoven's Ninth. It was equal parts satire and requiem. But the most meaningful moments weren't memes. The morning after, America opened its eyes to headlines it hadn't expected. On CNN, SEC launches official investigation into Elon Musk's Doge transactions and AI-linked trades involving Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene. On NPR, former President Donald Trump posting on Truth Social, "If these accusations are true, we may need to re-examine everything." And in the New York Times, an op-ed titled "Live Justice" began with only one sentence. It started with a letter. That same morning, the Capitol steps glowed under a warmer sun than the city had seen in days. Jasmine and Greg walked side by side, not as heroes, but as something quieter, witnesses who had finally been heard. They didn't speak much. The cameras still followed them, but from a distance now. This moment belonged not to press or politics, but to the people who had shown up. At the base of the steps stood a group of middle school students, teachers behind them, holding hand-painted signs. One boy, Korean American, maybe 10, held a white poster with blue crayon letters. "My sister Lana deserved to live." Beside him, a woman with silver hair stepped forward. She wore a pin shaped like a mannerism and walked with a quiet purpose. She took Greg's hand. "Thank you," she said, "for saying what so many of us couldn't." Not in time. Jasmine's eyes welled. She didn't wipe them away. In her hand, she held a worn copy of Lana's final letter, folded at the edges but intact. Greg glanced toward her. No one thought we'd move anything. Jasmine turned to him, the sunlight reflecting off her eyes. "That's because they forget. We don't have to move the whole system." She looked out across the crowd. "We just have to crack it open far enough to let the truth get in." Somewhere beyond the crowd, the wind caught the edge of a flag and lifted it slowly, not with pride, but with grace. And beneath it, across every living room, classroom, phone screen, and family kitchen in America, something subtle but powerful began to stir. People started asking questions they'd never asked before. One had stood for a friend who never made it past a statistic, another for a truth buried beneath the noise of elections and economics. And together, in a room meant to protect power, they reminded the country who that power was supposed to serve. Not all victories are televised. Not all justice ends in cheers. But sometimes it looks like a boy lifting a sign, a woman whispering "thank you," and a nation finally leaning forward to listen. Later that week, buried below the major headlines were a few lines most missed. Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act has been reopened for congressional review. The DOJ-related investigation has expanded to include several digital trading platforms suspected of insider activity. Reform discussions are underway in the House Ethics Committee. Nothing flashy, nothing loud. But that's the thing about justice. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it only needs someone brave enough to start the first sentence.